Hey, good morning, and thanks for joining us today on Farm Journal Live. I'm Farm Journal News Director John Harris, and our guest this morning is Michael Swanson, who's the Chief Ag Economist for Wells Fargo. Michael, thanks for joining us today. And you're somewhat famous for this quote about Tesla is the biggest challenge to agriculture, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But first, let's look at 2020. It's been a year of a lot of changes for agriculture, many of them brought on by COVID-19, many of them not. And as you've been speaking recently, you've been telling folks to look at those changes and what's structural and what's cyclical, because that impacts the long term impact of those changes. So walk us through some of the changes that you're seeing in 2020 in agriculture and how we should be looking at those changes.
It's interesting because too many people look at the world like a spreadsheet. They say, well, here's supply and demand, up supply, down demand, what's going to be the impact. We really should think about how things interact, and some things, when you change the technology, it's permanent. What it's going to, or you eliminate demand or you enhance demand, it's going to stay there forever. Other things, take El Derecho. I mean, it was a huge event in Iowa, but we don't expect to repeat it next year. So, some things like in COVID are going to be cyclical. One thing I expect to be cyclical is people eating at home. The long-term trend has been for people to eat away from home. They like the convenience, the variety, somebody else doing the dishes. And so as we open up restaurants again, we should expect people to go back to that long-term trend. So that shutdown on restaurants, cyclical. The impact, cyclical. But things like, at the processing level for pork and poultry, where now they want to look at, automation to avoid future pandemic issues, that might be structural, something that's going to stick around for a long time. So as you hear about issues as they come up in the news or in your life, you should try to start out by saying, you think, is this going to pass through or is this going to be permanent? Because your response should be very different.
Yeah, and in getting back to that restaurant notion, I would certainly agree. The trend is showing as things are opening up, people are starting to go back to restaurants. But aren't we going to see a structural change in how that restaurant serves its customer and what the customer expects from the restaurant?
Absolutely. That's a great point. When you think about labor availability, every farmer or processing facility around this country is struggling. We hear about high unemployment. At the same time, you struggle to find good employees at prevailing wages. So in the restaurant industry, they're going to have that problem. I don't think we're ever going to see them come back with the same type of labor structure. And so they're going to look to farmers and food processors to give them stuff that they can get to the consumer easily at that point of sale without a lot of labor. So that labor issue is going to be something that's going to be in everybody's world on a go forward basis. And it's going to be a big deal. Has been and will be.
Of course, agriculture has faced a number of other challenges over 2020, trade being one of the biggest. How do we look at that in 2021 and beyond?
And that's a good example of a mixture of both structural and cyclical. The dollar strength. Right now, the dollar is actually weakening a little bit from its strength. Federal Reserve has announced that they're going to be more complacent on inflation before some of the other banks have. So we're seeing that. That's kind of a cyclical thing. It comes and goes. There's some structural things. Long-term population growth trends around the world are slowing. And we expect to see less demand growth over the next 10 years in some of those markets. That doesn't mean there isn't good growth still to be had, but there's some structural things like that. So trade is a mixture of both the cyclical dollar events, strong dollar, weak dollar, and also those structural things where you have population growth really making a big difference over time.
And then you've got some issues, and we'll turn to the big quote now about Tesla being the biggest challenge for agriculture. You've got some issues that have been building for some time in a structural issue, and I think that's what you're trying to get at this notion of Tesla challenging agriculture.
It's a good example of thinking about alternative technologies. Batteries aren't static. There's a lot of research going on in the battery world in little things, how they get manufactured, chemistry they use, all those things. And if you're not on top of it, you might have an outdated view of what the batteries can do and what they cost. And if you're not really, really into it, you don't really anticipate where they're going. So next week, September 22nd, where Tesla has its battery day, they're going to announce all sorts of innovations. And if we think about it, what they're doing, everybody else is going to do. And if battery powered vehicles become useful in a lot more categories, you'll see more and more of them adopted. And what happens then is gasoline loses market share. If gasoline loses market share, ethanol loses market share. And we had 5.5 billion bushels of demand utilization at the beginning of the year. We're at 5 billion right now due to a drop of gasoline utilization right now. That hurts. If we think 5, 10, 15 years down the road and we cut gasoline in half, we cut ethanol in half, and we're going to have a lot more yield growth coming on. So this idea of losing demand permanently to an alternative technology, people don't really care how they get down the road. They want to get down the road as conveniently, as quickly, and as cheaply as possible. And if battery technology allows them to do that in a lot of circumstances, they're going to choose it. And so we have to think about what's coming, not where we're at or where we were at in the past. So Tesla is kind of a shorthand for technological disruption. And it's one of our big markets. Like I said, 5.5 billion beginning of the year, 5 billion right now due to some of the COVID impacts. But if we lose half of that over the next 10 or 15 years, it's going to be a challenge for us to find alternative demand sources for it. I mean, demand, yeah.
But I mean, is it fair to say that the fall off in fuel usage because of COVID in 2019 or in 2020 has really accelerated the ethanol industry's adaptation to that world that we're headed to, where batteries are more prevalent?
I think it was a real wake-up call. I mean, in April, we hit one point, we were at 3 billion bushels on an annualized rate for utilization. A lot of plants were closed down, margins were terrible. They've been improved since then. But I think it's been a real wake-up call for the industry. And, a lot of people kind of scoffed. I mean, and I get it. I mean, my cousins live out in the country. I go visit them, they're 50 miles from the Walmart. I mean, they want to have 400 miles of tank space or capacity when they go out on the road. But in the Twin Cities or Indianapolis or Chicago or LA, if you can go 125 miles in a daily charge, there's a lot more adaptation coming. So I think it has been a wake-up call for people that thought, oh, this could never happen, or it's going to happen so slowly, it makes no difference to us.
Well, and some of those ethanol plants actually looking at maybe at some of what has been side products off the ethanol production becoming the main product, whether it's DDGs or CO2 or whatever it is. I'm really looking more at what that business mix is for them.
Well, that's an interesting thing, and it happens a lot. Typically, you start out when you take things apart, you give away the least valuable thing, you don't worry about it. But over time, everybody starts wondering how they can generate more revenue. And distillers grains become almost as important to the
Yeah.
plants as the ethanol. And so we're seeing that they're saying, well, why am I giving away value? I call it the fractionation. And so we're going to see a lot more emphasis on taking distillers grain and making it a better feed product for markets around the world, including the United States. So it's an ongoing process, makes a lot of sense economically.
In 2020, a lot of farm income has been generated through government payment. How does that change in 2021 and beyond? I mean, obviously, farmers don't want to make their income that way. There will eventually become a wariness of taxpayers for farmers to get their income that way. So, and plus, you don't have the incentive of an upcoming election to continue it either. So, how does that continue from 2021 and beyond?
Well, hopefully the need for it will drop as well. The biggest disruption this year was in the livestock sector. We're so time dependent. When you can't go to market with your milk or with your hogs, it just there's no alternatives. You can hold your grain a little bit longer if you need to get disruption. So hopefully 2021 we won't have that need. We'll be back to more normalized livestock market, more normalized export world, and we'll see better opportunity there. So we probably won't need $33 billion of direct government payments to keep this industry as strong as it is right now. But you're right, deficits are going to be a big impact over time. The money's going to be tougher to come by. There's going to be more hands out for it, and they're going to be trying to pay off this debt. So I think farmers need to take that in consideration. And things that worked out this year, thanks to government payments, you might want to rethink rent negotiations, investments, whatever you're thinking about. I don't think we should take the additional payments into consideration as we plan for 2021. Might be tough decisions. Some landlords just won't hear about having a more reasonable rent payment, but it's tough. But it's something we have to really acknowledge on a go-forward basis. You just can't have $33 billion on a continual basis. It's just not going to be there politically.
So, in your view, what are the structural changes that will continue in agriculture once we get out of 2020 and COVID and the trade issues and uh, the other blips, if you will, that we've seen over 2020 that have had an outsized impact on agriculture?
Technology, of course, so much of the technology we use comes from outside of agriculture. And I think one of the big drivers is, are you good at adapting it and buying it at the right price? But technology is one of those things that really drives consolidation. I mean, so many of our farmers and operators are good at operating, but the technology is a real struggle for them. So I think one of the things we're going to see is accelerated technology adoption, and that's going to lead to a consolidation in operations as well. Doesn't mean there's not a good spot in agriculture for people. People that are consolidating also need excellent employees, and hopefully they know how to treat them fair. But you're gonna have a different thing. So that technology piece is going to be driving consolidation. But does it necessarily consolidate land ownership? Because cash rent is the biggest driver in the market. So there's two things going on there. We're seeing that consolidation via technology, but the assets are something that I'm still struggling with how they're going to consolidate because they're very expensive right now.
Yeah, and that consolidation even goes into our. You're saying that we should look at land use and the cost of land in farm production in that consolidation. Can you tell us what you've been telling farmers at some of your seminars about that look at land?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is it makes sense where land prices are. That's surprising for a conservative economist banker to say. But when you can borrow money as cheaply as you can borrow today, and the alternative opportunities for CDs and other conservative investments are so low, it makes sense that land values have gone up because people look at comparisons. They would never have taken this type of a cash rent on a percentage basis 20 years ago because they would have had a much better opportunity. But in today's world, it makes sense. But having said that, the biggest issue we see in every survey of land values, every cash rent model, is that good ground is priced very aggressively, but bad ground's priced way too aggressively. There's too many people who are chasing mediocre and average ground to be growing, and the cash rent market is penalizing them for paying for that poorer ground because it just never gives them the yield. I mean, you put the same seed, the same fertilizer, use the same equipment on it, use the same talent, and you have 10, 15% less yield in any given year, and your cost of production is just out of proportion to the rest of your ground. But the market is just not disciplined. So that's the biggest issue around the microeconomics for a farmer is how do I recognize mediocre and poor ground and how do I stay off it because it just dilutes my effort.
Or come up with the information to take to a landlord to lower the rent accordingly to what that land is producing.
Oh, if it was only that easy. When we think about it, the landlord's logical as well. He says, "Well, I got three other people lined up behind you who are willing to pay that rent or higher to take over the ground. So even if you're right, and I should lower my rent by 50, $60 to make it on a per bushel basis competitive with the real market, why would I give up 50, $60 per acre of rent if somebody else was willing to give it to me?"
Yeah.
Sometimes with a long-term relationship, they will do that for you. But too often we see that there's just too many, let's call it the greater fool in the rent market. So more often than not, it comes down to your discipline and your willingness to say, "Hey, let somebody else lose money on this ground. I got better things to do with my time in terms of making money."
Indeed. Well, and let's wrap up with a series of questions that you've been saying that any ag producer needs to look at. Obviously, starting with what are my crops worth, but I think probably even more key is why do the crops have that value?
Let's go back to the example of ethanol. As a producer of corn, you should always know what the ethanol producer is making. You should also understand where the margins are in the feed market, for poultry or hogs or cattle. Because when somebody buys corn from you, it's to make money. And if they can't make money, they don't want to buy the corn from you. And that's true of any crop. And so it's really important for us as producers to understand our consumers and their margins. And we can't begrudge them margins because if we don't have an industry that's buying money, making money from us, and when they buy it from us, they will not be around for us to work with.
Indeed. And then you get into who gets what share, which has long been a discussion in agriculture, especially those looking at specialty products.
Well, let's talk. Give an example like seed technology or fertilizer. Farmers always seem to begrudge that technology. It's expensive, but the real question is, are you over or underpaying for that technology? Right now, we look at fertilizer prices and we say, oh, they're relatively cheap versus where they were a year ago or 2 years ago. But they're really priced pretty historically in terms of the margin they produce for production. And so we need to dig into that as individual producers and understand what's the right margin. Are we overpaying or underpaying? But we need them. Agriculture is a team sport. Life is a team sport. And we need to have the right teammates working with us, but they want to get paid. I mean, the world's best quarterback with a bad offensive line is just a target.
Indeed. And then the last two questions kind of play into each other. What differentiates your production, you as a producer, and then what's your play to maximize profit?
Right, because you think to yourself, if I'm going to do things just like everybody else, I'm going to make the same margin as everybody else. And I'm going to circle back to even that simple one of being a more disciplined cash renter. Let's say you're at, pick a number out of the air, 2,000 acres. Maybe you go back to 1,600 acres because 400 of those are really overpriced cash rent. And it hurts to go backwards. Nobody wants to go to the coffee shop and say, hey, yeah, I was farming 2,000, now I'm at 1,600. But if you're making more money and doing it better, that differentiates you. That discipline. Now, easier said than done is an old saying, but there's a lot of reality in that. So think about, what am I going to do differently? Because if I just go and do it like everybody else, I'm going to have everyday margins. And I want above average margins because that's what's going to make my family strong, keep them in business for multiple generations.
Hey, Michael Swanson, thanks so much for the time this
Thank you,
morning.
John.
Thoughts, as we get closer to wrapping up this unusual year and look forward to 2021 and beyond. All right, well, that's going to wrap up today's Farm Journal Live. Be sure to check back in at noon Central today, where Chip Flory is going to talk with John Newton, who is the chief economist for the American Farm Bureau Federation. Among other things, they're going to touch on what needs to be in the second round of the coronavirus food assistance program that is expected to be announced any day. So join us then, noon Central, here on Farm Journal Live.